Hi there, my name is Simon, and I'm a student or a PhD candidate at Cornell University's Department of Anthropology. So today I'll be talking about some origin stories of money. And one thing to keep in mind as we advance through this presentation is that these are just stories. They're not final answers, they're not conclusions about what money is, he's just exploring some stories, all right? So, go ahead. So, so Nigel Dodd's first chapter, he gives us 6 different stories about money's origins. And he starts out by pointing out that one thing about if we define money, so we say, what is money? You know, if we define money, we have to sort of, if we define money, to sort of decide on what money is, we have to first sort of settle on the origins of money, on where it came from. So in that sense, you decide on the origin of money, and you settle the question of where it came from. Then you're sort of defining what money is, which then you can subsequently determine what money should be, how it should be used, how governments have to implement policies. So it's actually, you know, to claim to know the origin of money is actually a political act, I'll say. So this is not what Nigel Dodd is trying to do. He's trying to, it's a quote from his book, I want to open a line of argument about money's diversity. So money is a remarkably diverse phenomenon. He wants to appreciate the different ways in which money takes form in the world. He's not trying to settle on an answer. So if you're going to take away one thing from this chapter, I know it's a difficult chapter you were telling me, it's just that. He's not trying to conclude what money is. He's trying to open it up and give us a flexible framework, starting with the 6 stories that he goes through in the first chapter. So one thing about this is he says that money's variance is an opportunity, not an impediment. It doesn't get in the way. It's an opportunity because if we appreciate the diversity of how money you know, is brought together, how money comes about in society, we can think of money's variation as sort of fodder for the imagination. So again, you know, it's a tool for the imagination. Especially, this is a very sort of timely way of thinking of money, because, you know, since 2008 and before that as well, you know, there's been a kind of an explosion, a proliferation in new money forms, and so we want to try and understand all these different forms and the kinds of things we can do with it, and you know. So anyway, it's all about variety. Go ahead. Now, the first 2 accounts that Nigel Dodd explores are the economic and sociological, and you, Jong-sung, explored the sociological perspective with Ingham. So I'm not going to get into that one, but basically the distinction between the 2 is you can sort of distinguish between agency and structure. So agency is the idea that it's humans that make the world, that I have free will and all of my ideas are my own and I'm not influenced by anybody else. It's all me doing, you know, defining myself and defining my actions. While structure is the sociological perspective, which stipulates that we are products of our social environment. So your class, your gender, your ethnicity, your nationality, your upbringing, all of these things have shaped you into a particular individual. And so there's really no sort of, let's say, free will in this particular framework. It's all wider structures shaping you into a particular subject. So yeah, so agency, you have the individual on one end of the spectrum, and then you have society on the other. And then this economic point of view focuses on the market. So the market is where money began, whereas in the sociological perspective, it began with the state. Now, I'll talk a little bit about because Jong-sung talked about Ingham's perspective, which is over here, and then this perspective is represented in Dodd's book by Carl Menger, who said that money originates in the market not the polity, though at the end of his chapter, or his article rather, he does sort of concede that, you know, the state perhaps perfected the money, but ultimately the origins of money are completely alien to the state, to the polity. So he asks the question here, well, why did people exchange metal discs? And if you think of that question, it's kind of strange. Why do people exchange these little metal discs? It's a really interesting question. And he says that money would, you know, eventually over time, as people barter with one another, spontaneously become the most saleable commodity. So it's all about salability. So let's say I have a chair and I want to exchange for a table. What I have to do is I have to find two things. I have to find a person who needs a chair and wants to sell a table. Two things together is very difficult to find in a marketplace. So when you have something like a coin, which is, you know, very durable, very small, you can carry it around in a bag, let's say, it makes things much easier. Now all I have to find with my money, or, you know, in a money economy, is just somebody, if I have a chair, somebody who needs a chair. That's it. And then I get the money. And then I go and I find somebody, just with, you know, one factor here, find somebody who wants to sell a table. So it really facilitates exchange. It's based on the rational actor model. If you read the article, there's really no idea of society. It's just people, for some reason, just the assumption is here that people just want to exchange with one another. If you meet anybody, anywhere, your first spontaneous thought will be, how can we exchange? So this is a very nice theory, of course, Karl Menger's theory. Unfortunately, it's not historically supported. In fact, he does mention history in his article, but he says that, well, nobody's concluded anything in history, so why don't we just take history and throw it out the window? And I'll just make up my own theory that is very logical, and I'll use my reason and come up with this. And it's actually a very intuitive theory. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, it's very easy to understand, and it fits economic models, you know, which is why it's such a popular theory today, and most economic models use this market-based theory of money. Thanks. Now I want to talk about two more. How's my, nobody's got the time? So about Simmel's quantification. So George Simmel is quite interesting, and he's one of the center, one of the centerpieces, or the most important thinker in Nigel Dodd's book. One thing to keep in mind about Simmel is that he doesn't have this idea. He's not a very like solid or rigid sociologist. He's like, society doesn't exist independent of humans, like some kind of collective conscience, you know, as Durkheim would say. But it's rather a process of association. It's people making society with one another. We're exchanging, we're associating with one another, we're creating relationships. This is what society is. There's nothing beyond that. And the same goes with the economy. The economy is made through exchange. There's no economy that exists before people exchanging with one another. And he brings up the concept of mutual sacrifice. When you exchange something, you have to give something in return, right? So if I want a particular object, I have to give up something to get that object, right? And then next is that value arises in the exchange process. So it's only through the exchange that value arises. And what he defines as value is it's the distance. You could call it, you can think of it as like Euclidean. It's not Euclidean distance, but the distance between the person and the object in the form of the sacrifice. So how far do I have to get to attaining this particular object in the form of a sacrifice, like work, or how much do I have to give up, these kinds of things. And so this sort of sets the conditions of possibility for the formation of money, because money gives value a sort of quantifiable expression, right? So it's a sort of quantification of sacrifice, and then it becomes price. So now we think of objects themselves as just having a price. But one thing to keep in mind is that the value is the distance. So it's a relational thing. It's a relation. It's the space between the object and the person. It's not the object itself, right? Quantification leads to the objectification of subjective culture. This is sort of what scholars of money typically think of George Simmel as, you know, thinking that he called the money the frightful equalizer, that it just annihilates all qualitative differences and makes everything quantifiable and commensurable and therefore exchangeable with everything else. But according to Dodd, this is not accurate. This is not an accurate depiction of the way Simmel thought about money. What Simmel thought was fundamentally that people seek difference. That we, if you think of your life, like every day has to be a little bit different from the last one. If everything was the same, day in, day out, same, you would, I don't know, you would die of boredom maybe or something, So, and if money erases all these all the differences between things, and make all of our social relations quantifiable, and therefore commensurable, what he said rather was that we protect ourselves with this sort of blasé attitude, a kind of like, whatever, we kind of become indifferent to all this kind of similarity. But at the same time, what happens is that money drives us to produce more difference. And so it sort of gives you an explanation for, the proliferation of specializations and variations across society through money. And so this also goes back to this idea it complicates the idea of modern money, which is that we all think that money just equalizes everything, but in fact it does equalize everything, and at the same time it generates a proliferation of difference and variation. So you have a kind of dialectic in Simmel's thought, if that makes sense. Next slide.